So what I'm going to talk about tonight are these topics. The gear that I use and that you may want to consider using, how to make the images, the question of arranging things in interesting patterns, the kinds of subjects, whether they're translucent, semi-opaque, or completely opaque, post-processing, some alternative techniques for treating your photographs, and resources for additional information. How much of a time lag is there between what I'm saying and what you're hearing?
It looks okay to me.
Okay, I don't want to talk too fast if it's going to be a problem. So let's start out with gear and some basic options for gear. The first thing you need to have is a light pad. You can use an old slide sorting box if you have one, but light pads are better because they have more uniform light. The old slide boxes usually had a couple of fluorescent tubes in them, and the light wasn't intended for backlighting photographs. It was intended for viewing slides, and the quality isn't nearly as good. If you're going to get a light box, the desirable features are get a large one. Get one that's lit by LEDs. Get one that you can dim the light. They come in a variety of sizes and configurations. You can get a good selection of them on Amazon. They cost pretty far under $100. I think I paid $70 for a pretty good sized one that I'll show you a little bit later.
What terminology do you use when you're searching on Amazon?
Light pad.
Okay. All right.
You also need some way to support your camera. You cannot really do this handheld.
Okay.
So if you don't, you can use a tripod. I use a copy stand, which I think works really well. One issue with the tripod is that the legs get in the way, but you can work around that. So the point is you can get into this without spending a lot of money. You're also going to need to have a lens. They recommend a prime lens rather than a zoom lens, mainly because zoom lenses tend to creep when you have them facing downward like this. Now you can get around that by using some gaffer tape or some painter's tape to hold your lens in position so it doesn't creep. You want to shoot in the 40 to 60 millimeter range. 50 millimeters is pretty good. A manual focus lens or a lens set to manual focus is what you want rather than autofocus. It doesn't matter what f-stop the lens is capable of because you're going to be doing time exposures anyway. It can be a macro lens, but it does not have to be unless you're going to get in really close. Most of the time, your pictures are going to be backed off far enough that just a normal prime lens or a normal zoom lens will work just fine. Again, the point is you probably already have a lens that will work so that you don't necessarily have to go out and get something new. You're also going to need to have some tools, and I don't know if you can see this whole slide or not. On the right-hand side is a rocket blower. Good tools to have are a pair of tweezers for positioning your subjects, some sharp scissors or pruning shears to cut off the stems of flowers or branches, a sharp knife if you're going to be slicing up fruits and vegetables. A mandolin is even better because you can get good even slices and you can control the thickness very easily with the mandolin. And as I mentioned, a dust blower, because you need to keep the little tiny particles off your light box in order to prevent dirty specks from showing up. Here's my setup. It's a Smith Victor copy stand that I got from B&H. The light pad, I've indicated the brand name there. It's an HSK A2 light pad, and it's 18 by 25 inches. I paid $70 for it on Amazon. My lens is a Zeiss 50 millimeter macro lens. But as I said, you don't have to use a macro lens. You can use really any lens that's capable of about 50 millimeters, and that would work pretty well. So now making images. The key here is how you compose your images and how you expose them. The first thing is you want to arrange your subjects in an attractive fashion. Composition is really important, as it is in everything photographic. Whoops. All right, now how can I get that back? All right. Some of the possibilities for composition are circles and curves, arranging things in circles and curves, arranging them in facing pairs, setting up mirror images, or taking pictures of individual things. And I'll make some additional suggestions a little bit later for ways that you can arrange things. And I'll show you some things as well. Exposure is different from normal photography. You want to make multiple exposures. I mean, you can just take one picture, but you won't get the best quality if you do that. The best quality will be if you make multiple exposures like you're doing HDR. You want to capture the full range of whites and blacks. It's recommended, Harold Davis, who's an expert at this, recommends between 7 and 9 exposures, one EV apart. Use manual exposure. Set your ISO low to get the maximum quality. Change your shutter speed to make the exposures while keeping your f-stop fixed. If you don't do that, if you change the f-stop, you're going to change the depth of field on each exposure, and that's going to cause problems. You may want to do that for creative reasons, but normally you wouldn't want to do that. F8 to F11 is a good range to set your lens. If you have a subject that has some thickness, you may want to go to F16 to F22 to get additional depth of field. You do want to make sure to use enough depth of field to capture the whole subject's depth. Some things that you might want to consider photographing are flowers and flower petals, fruits and vegetables, plants and weeds that have some interesting structure to them, leaves, shells, other opaque items that you would want to perhaps silhouette against the white background. In putting things into patterns and arrangements, here's an opportunity to be creative. One example would be if you choose a single subject, in this case, an orange, where you're showing off the profile of the item. In this case, I exposed the white is the light box. The slice is maybe 1/8 of an inch thick, and it does have some top lighting on it because otherwise the orange color would be in silhouette. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. You can also set up pairs of items. In this case, a pair of snow peas. Or you can put things in random patterns or in patterns that suggest some kind of design. This happens to be the flowers and the seed pods of a Japanese maple tree. Or you can put things in a circle. I went out in the yard and I picked some dandelions, a dandelion seed head in the middle, and then some of these little purple violets that just pop up in the yard. Um, but you can create an interesting arrangement that way. Or a mandala, in this case, azalea blossoms. Again, I plucked them out of the yard earlier this week and made that particular photograph. Some other possibilities, you could arrange things in a fan shape, in a spiral shape. You could create geometric patterns. Pictorial designs. I saw somebody who put together a string of flower blossoms to make it look like a Chinese dragon that you would see at the beginning of the Chinese New Year. You can do extreme close-ups where you may only show a part of a flower blossom or a part of some other object. And you can put things in completely random placements. And I'm sure, you can think of other things that you could do in addition to those possibilities. Now let's talk about subjects a minute. First of all, some of your subjects are going to be translucent. And when you do those, they're going to be backlit and lit through the subject by the light pad. In this case, you're doing high key photography so that you're going to have a white background. This gives a much more delicate effect, and it reveals the internal structure of the subjects, kind of like the orange that I showed you earlier, which is mostly translucent, but not entirely so. Then there are opaque subjects in which the light pad gives a white background against something that is either totally or partially silhouetted. In that case, you need to do things differently. You need some front lighting to reveal the surface of the dark subject. If you choose side lighting, it can reveal some texture in the subject. The light pad will still be a white background, and it may shine some light through some subjects, like the orange, which was partially translucent. I like the copy stand because my copy stand has two LED light panels on the side that I can position. I can turn, there's one on each side. I can turn one on or both of them on, and I can move them around. But there are other ways of getting to that. You don't have to, use a light stand. You use the same exposure methods for opaque items as you do for translucent ones. I mean, the same HDR sequence. You can, if you want, I haven't tried it yet, but I'm going to use a raking light of a different color to give a color cast to your subject, pink or purple or blue or something like that. I have no idea what it will look like, but I think it would be fun to experiment with it. So semi-opaque items like the orange or, well, like some other things that I'll show you, need to have at least a little side lighting or a little top lighting to show the color and the texture of the surface. They won't, the light from the light pad won't shine totally through and illuminate those. So here's an apple slice, for example, which is partially backlit through the light box, but it also has some side lighting to reveal the surface texture and color. Another example is this pear slice. Again, I had some side lighting on this. Completely opaque subjects absolutely require side or top lighting. Otherwise, they'll end up being a complete silhouette. So here is a collage of beans that you wouldn't be able to see them if I hadn't used some some top lighting to reveal their surface colors and texture. Or these are actually tea leaves that, again, are opaque and needed to have some side lighting to reveal both the texture and the surface color. Post-processing, you need to use a program that allows you to use layers and masks. This is something you cannot do in Lightroom. I mean, you may start in Lightroom, but you can't finish there. So a program such as Photoshop or On1 Photo Raw, or there are other programs that you could use to do that use layers and masks. You want to import your photographs, your sequence of photographs as different layers and arrange them by light levels, with the lightest one on the bottom and then progressing to the darkest ones at the top layers. Harold Davis, from whom I've taken a lot of this information, likes to create an HDR composite of all of those layers and set it aside. I haven't done that. I'll explain why he does that in a minute, but I mean, that's an option. So you want to import your photos into Photoshop as layers. As I said, put the lightest one on the bottom, the darkest one on the top. Then when you edit, basically you start at the bottom and move up and progressively apply a hide all layer mask to each layer. And what you do is when you go to, say, the second layer and you use a hide all layer mask, it won't show that layer until you paint in selected parts of it with a white paintbrush, usually set on fairly soft. You do one layer, then you move up to the next. So you're progressively layering in more depth and more darkness as you go. You only go as far as you need to go to make the picture look the way you want it to look. When you get done, what Davis does is he then brings in the HDR composite that he's created, puts that as the top layer, and blends in some of that to pump up his colors. As I said, I have not done that yet. I probably will explore that at some point, but I'm still learning this process. Okay, so here it is again. From Lightroom, go to Edit In, and then open Photoshop as layers. Stack your images from the lightest at the bottom to the darkest at the top. And what I have found is that Photoshop, they don't come into Photoshop in that sequence. At least one of them is always going to be out of sequence, and you have to drag it to the place in the stack where it belongs in terms of its luminosity level. You set your background layer, your foreground layer to the background of the lightest image using the eyedropper. So in other words, go to your bottom layer, click the eyedropper on the white, and that will set your foreground layer to that white, and that's what you're going to be using to paint in onto your black masks as you go up the stack. Then for each of the layers, create the hide all layer mask, paint in whatever features you want to darken with white using your paintbrush. Use a soft brush. He goes to less than 50%, where he just wants a touch of a particular color you don't need to use all the layers that you've imported. I never have. It ends up bringing in some that are so dark that I can't use them, and I just ignore them. I only go up the list as far as I need to get the effect that I want to get. This is what the screen looks like in Photoshop. And the key here is that on the right-hand side, I don't know if you can see my mouse. Here's the bottom layer, which is almost totally white. Here's the next layer that you can begin to see the image. The third layer, you begin to see more of the image, and I've created a hide all mask, and you can see a little bit of white there where I have painted in with the brush on, on the dandelions, and I went and painted on the violets to darken those, to bring this layer into the stack. When I got done with that, I moved up to the next layer and did the same thing, bringing in a little bit. This is a little bit darker, and when you paint on this layer mask, it brings that deeper richness into the picture. I don't know if I ever used this top layer. It's looking to me like I may have done so. A lot of times there'll be 3 or 4 other layers above that are just totally black practically, and I ignore them. So, I mean, that's what the process looks like. There are other techniques you can use that are, for more advanced processing. One of them is you can take your photograph once you've edited it and swap out the luminosity channels. And in Photoshop, you would do that by converting your RGB image into LAB mode. Then you check the L channel, which is the luminosity channel in LAB, and you invert that channel, basically swapping dark for light and light for dark. Then you convert back from LAB to RGB, because you can't really do anything with LAB except edit. You can't print from there. You couldn't go to a screen share from there. You can also play with the A and B channels. They control red and green and blue and yellow, and you can swap those to create different kinds of visual effects with colors. And I haven't done that at this point, but I've seen it done, and it can be interesting as an adjunct to this process. Here's an example of a photograph that I did the luminosity inversion on. It was a circle of feathers. You can imagine what the feathers normally look like. And on the left are the exact steps that I took. I went to image mode LAB. Then I checked L for the luminosity channel. I then inverted that channel by going to image adjustments invert, or on a PC, you can use Control I. And then I converted it back by going to image mode RGB. And it was as simple as that. Now you can play with it. I mean, once you get it in LAB, you can play with the luminosity levels, and you can blend things differently. But in this case, I didn't do anything. I just did exactly what it said on the left, and that was how I got the picture. You can also do monochrome when you're working with light pad photography. Some things just look better in monochrome. And in that case, once you've made your photograph on a light table, or on a light pad, simply convert it to monochrome, to sepia or to black and white, or whatever you want, by using whatever method you normally create your monochrome images. There are some good resources out there to go further with this. Harold Davis has done a lot with this. His new book is Creative Garden Photography, and it provides a good introduction to some of these techniques. He's written other books on flower photography and on Photoshop techniques that are useful. But one of the best things you can do is check out his YouTube broadcasts. He's been holding Zoom training sessions. I think he charges about $30 for a couple of hour session where you can sit in with him as he works through these things and you can ask him questions. But if you don't want to spend the money or you can't do it on the Saturdays that he scheduled these things, he puts them all up on YouTube after about 2 weeks, so you can get them for free. And he has done, I think, at least five major presentations on light pad photography that are up on YouTube. His website is down on the bottom there, digitalfieldguide.com/learning, and that'll take you to his YouTubes. He's very good about that. And actually, you can also, once you've watched these things, he invites you to send his pictures to him. I don't know how much he's going to do in terms of giving you a professional commentary, but at least you may get an attaboy from him. So give it a try. Get some subjects from your garden or from your yard. Maybe even just get some weeds and grasses from ditches that have interesting structure to them for silhouette possibilities. This is a good activity to do while we're still restricted by COVID. It doesn't have to cost very much. You may already have a good lens for this. You probably already have a tripod. The only thing you may need to have is a light pad. If you don't have a good lens, you can get a 50mm lens pretty cheaply on the used market. It doesn't have to be the best lens in the world, and it doesn't have to have a wide open f-stop in order to make decent pictures, since you won't be using that range anyway. You'll be using f8, f11 and making time exposures. So that's the presentation. I'll stop sharing now and be glad to take any questions that you've got.
Norm, you mentioned the other piece of equipment is the copy stand, and I'm not familiar with that. Does that have other uses, or what is that exactly?
Well,
what is that?
Yeah, they were designed for if you're copying books or you're copying manuscripts or papers, or I suppose photographing stamps and
so yeah, with that
where
vertical,
you want to be in a fixed position like that.
Got it.
But unless you have, I mean, I use it because I do a lot of that kind of photography. But you can get by with a tripod. It's just a little awkward to point downward from a tripod and keep the legs out of the picture. But now one trick is, let's suppose you take a picture and the legs get in on the edges of your picture. You can get rid of those pretty easily on your lowest layer, on your lightest layer. Go ahead and erase those legs from that layer. Then you can copy. There's a way in Photoshop to copy the mask from the lowest layer to other layers. What you do is you use Alt and holding down the Alt key, you drag the layer from the lowest layer to the next one up, and it'll copy that layer so that whatever you've done on the bottom layer will also appear on the next layer up. So you can basically get rid of the tripod legs by just wiping them out. And apparently that's a common problem with tripods.
Sure. Well, that's a good tip. Thank you.
Sure.
Norm, any recommendations on focal length for a fixed lens, not wider than, but not narrower than, so to speak? I mean, is a 35 millimeter too wide, or 105 too long?
100, well, the problem with 105 is you're going to have to be pretty high up, probably, unless you're trying to make close-up pictures.
Yeah.
I mean, more macro type pictures. You could probably get away with that. 35, you're going to be closer to the subject. The issue there may be some softness on the edges of your picture, but in many of these cases, the edges are going to be white, so it may not matter. So you probably could get away with a 35. At least it would be worth experimenting with that,
All right.
you know, before you go out and spend a bunch of money. You may decide you don't even like this kind of photography, in which case, you know, why would you want to buy a, you
Yeah.
know, an expensive lens for it?
Well, I think I have a 50 lying around here somewhere. I'll have to see if I can make it work.
Yeah, well, it'll be a question of can you make it fit the camera, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, it's been around a long time. Will it work with my newer cameras? We'll find out.
Yeah.
Well, I thought your photographs of the fruit and the flowers, they're all just really, really nice. Thank
Well,
you
thank
for,
you.
I mean, they're beautiful. One question is with the slices of, I think one was an apple. You had mentioned the mandolin. How thin would you say that slice was of the
The
fruit?
one
Like
I took,
how thin do
yeah,
you get it?
the apple I cut with a knife, and it
Uh-huh.
wasn't nearly as thin as I'd like it to have been.
Okay.
Which is why it wasn't as translucent as it could have been.
Okay.
I only got the mandolin about a few days ago.
Uh-huh.
I saw a recommendation for it and decided that, you know, that would let me maybe do a 16th of an inch or something. I think probably the apple slice that I used was more than an eighth of an inch thick. Probably it was more like 3/16 of an inch. A little
Uh-huh.
too thick, I think.
Okay. Well, it was really, it was very nice, and
Well, thank you.
I can see how the thinner, better, then you can get the fibrous structure and things like that.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm making a list of other kinds of things that I want to photograph, and they include things like um, the buttercups that are showing up in my yard, to
Mhm.
make a display of those. Instead of the azaleas, instead of showing whole blossoms the way I did, picking the petals off and just using the petals to form a pattern of some kind.
Mhm.
Picking clover leaves and using clover leaves to make some kind of design.
Mhm.
Um, Picking some weeds that I can use to silhouette to create different kinds of silhouette patterns. Um, and then there are all kinds of opaque things that you can make silhouettes out of too. Um, so I'm collecting ideas at this point.
So what's the advantage? What you just mentioned, the opaque. Um, when I see the translucence, you know, I get that on the Lightbox, but then
Uh-huh.
having the opaque items, is it just that you have this flat surface? I mean, is there any other elements about the light itself that comes into play with an opaque item?
The only advantage that you get out of it is that the background is totally white.
Okay.
I
Mhm.
mean, you could photograph them against any kind of background. In this
Mhm.
case, it just makes them white. Um,
Mhm.
if you wanted to silhouette them, then you wouldn't use top lighting. You'd only use the back lighting, and they
Right.
would come out as black on white, essentially.
Uh-huh.
Um, and that could be interesting um, as an alternative. But the, as you point out, the most interesting thing are the ones that are translucent, where you see the
Oh yeah.
internal structure,
Mhm.
you know, the veins in leaves or the veins in fruits and vegetables, um, the fibers.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, it's beautiful photography.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
And it seems like a lot of effort though. I mean, was your learning
Um,
curve with all the whole
well, it has
the
been for me, especially the Photoshop
post-processing?
part of it, learning how to, I mean,
Yeah.
I can spend a fair amount of time on Photoshop on any one image. you know, just trying to deal with all those layers. On the other hand, I'm finding that to be kind of fun.
Mhm. It's good for the brain, huh?
Well, it is. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, there is a bit of a learning curve, but at this point, it's fairly routine for me to make the images.
good.
Um,
Yeah.
somebody um, somebody suggested at the last skills session that they were using Nikon SnapBridge to control their camera, and I have been using that to basically I set my camera up to do a multiple cycle through the images, the sequence.
Yeah, we lost part of that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Um, I use Nikon SnapBridge
Mhm.
to trigger the camera. And if I set up an HDR sequence, I can, you know, let's say I set it up for 9 pictures. I will trigger that 9 times, and it'll cycle through the whole range of exposures. And I don't have to touch the camera. You don't
Mhm.
you want your pictures to be in perfect registration. You don't want any vibrations
Right.
between exposures.
Well, is that specific to Nikon, or I mean, is there a
Well,
Canon
that's
equivalent?
um, the SnapBridge. It was Nikon SnapBridge. I don't know what's available for other cameras, except there is a device called Photography that I talked about last time. It's a little plug-in device that you can get for pretty much any camera model, I think, or for many at least. Um, Now it costs about $200, but it does the same kind of thing where you can remotely trigger your camera. There are other cheaper things. Velo makes an intervalometer that you can attach to any camera, and again, it's, you know, a remote, um, I guess Bluetooth or Wi-Fi connection, so that you don't have to touch the camera in order to
Mhm.
trigger it. And those cost about $60 or $70, I think. And
Okay.
I've got one that I'd be glad to get rid of, except it's probably for Nikon.
Okay.
Yeah, Janet, I'm fairly sure Canon has their own version of Nikon SnapBridge. You may want to research their
Yeah,
web.
that's what I would do.
Yeah.
I wrote the term down so I can do a little research on that. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions about this?
Thank you very much, Norm. That was great.